The sound of screeching brakes still echoed in Jake's ears as he stumbled forward, his breath caught in his throat. Max wasn't moving. His golden fur was matted with dirt, his chest rising and falling in shallow, unsteady breaths. "Max?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. The police officer, a tall man with a square jaw and a heavy belt weighed down by authority, barely glanced at the boy. He clicked his tongue, shaking his head as if this was just another minor inconvenience in his shift. "I said, keep your dog off the road, kid," the officer repeated, his tone laced with indifference. Jake's fists tightened. His whole body shook, not from fear, but from something hotter, heavier. Rage. Another officer stepped out of the car, younger, nervous. Should we?" "Forget it," the first cop snapped. "We don't have time for this." Jake barely heard them. He was kneeling beside Max, feeling his fur grow colder under his fingers. Tears stung his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. His dad always told him, never show weakness, especially in front of people who don't care. And these cops? They didn't care. But they would. Jake slowly stood up, his heart pounding. His voice, though quiet, cut through the air like a blade. "You don't know who I am, do you?" The officers exchanged glances. The first cop scoffed. "Should I?" Jake's lips curled into a smile that had nothing to do with humor. "My dad runs your station." Silence. For the first time, the officer hesitated. Jake took a step closer, staring straight into the man's suddenly uneasy eyes. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The silence between Jake and the officer stretched thick in the evening air. The first cop, his name tag read Parker, tilted his head, processing what the boy had just said. "You're bluffing," Parker muttered, though the flicker of doubt in his eyes betrayed him. Jake crossed his arms, his rage boiling beneath the surface. "Go ahead. Call your station. Tell them what you did." His voice was steady, controlled. It was the way his father spoke when he was deadly serious. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sarge, maybe we should." Parker shot him a glare, silencing him instantly. But his bravado was slipping. He pulled out his radio, hesitating for just a second before pressing the button. "This is Officer Parker. We have a incident. Need to confirm something. Who's the commanding officer on duty tonight?" Static. Then, a crackling voice, "Captain Reynolds." "Why?" Jake saw the blood drain from Parker's face. Jake smirked. "Yeah. That's my dad." The younger officer swallowed hard. "Sarge, we..." Parker didn't wait for him to finish. He grabbed Jake by the arm, his grip tight, almost desperate. "Listen, kid," he hissed. "This is just a stupid accident. You don't need to make a big deal out of this." Jake yanked his arm free, his eyes burning with fury. "You ran over my dog," he said, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger. "And you didn't even care." Max let out a weak whimper, and Jake dropped back to his knees beside him. He was still alive, but for how long? Parker exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. He knew he was in trouble. We'll pay the vet bill or something, all right? Just don't." Jake didn't answer. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed. 3 rings. Then, a voice that made Parker stiffen like a soldier caught in the act. "Jake? What's wrong?" Jake locked eyes with Parker, his expression cold. "Dad," he said. "The cops just ran over Max." The silence on the other end was deadly. Then, Captain Reynolds' voice dropped to something quiet. "Something dangerous. Where are you?" Jake let a slow smile creep onto his face as he gave his location. Parker stepped back, his breath shallow. The younger cop looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "You screwed up," Jake said softly, standing up again. "And now? You're gonna pay for it." The sound of sirens in the distance made Parker's face go pale. Justice was coming. The night air was thick with tension. Jake could still feel the heat of Parker's glare even after the squad car had disappeared down the street. But Parker's last words echoed in his head, chilling him more than the evening breeze. "This ain't over, kid." Jake gritted his teeth, shoving his hands into his hoodie pockets. He could still feel the adrenaline in his veins, a buzzing energy that wouldn't go away. His father hadn't said much since arriving, but Jake could see the controlled fury in his posture. Captain Reynolds was a man who played by the rules, but tonight, Jake had seen something different in him. A crack in the usual composure. "Get in the car," his father said, voice tight. Jake obeyed, slipping into the passenger seat. The moment the doors shut, his dad grabbed his radio and pressed the button. "This is Captain Reynolds," he said, his voice calm but dangerous. "I want an update on Parker's detainment. Now." Static. Then, a voice responded. Sir, Parker hasn't been processed yet." His father's grip on the radio tightened. "Excuse me?" There was a hesitation. Then. "They, never brought him in, sir." Jake's stomach dropped. Reynolds' knuckles went white on the wheel. "Where the hell is he?" Silence. Then, the voice on the radio came back, lower this time. Almost afraid. "Sir, we don't know." The ride home was silent. But it wasn't the kind of silence that felt peaceful. It was the kind that carried the weight of something bad just beyond the horizon. Jake kept glancing at his father, waiting for him to say something, anything. But his dad's jaw was set, his eyes locked on the road like he was trying to outdrive his own thoughts. "Dad?" Jake finally said. His father didn't answer right away. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled just as carefully. "There's a system," he said finally, his voice low. "A protocol. When an officer is arrested, he's supposed to be processed immediately." Jake's hands clenched into fists. "So why wasn't he?" His father exhaled again, gripping the wheel so hard it creaked. "Because someone let him go." Jake felt his blood run cold. By the time they pulled into the driveway, a storm had settled in Jake's chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Max, still groggy from the vet, let out a weak whimper in the back seat. Jake turned to scratch behind his ears. "We're home, buddy." But even as he said it, home didn't feel as safe as it had before. His father got out first, scanning the street. His movements were sharp, precise. Then, Jake saw it. The front door. Slightly open. His father froze. So did Jake. They had locked it before they left. Jake was sure of it. His dad reached for his gun. "Stay in the car." Jake ignored him and followed. No way was he sitting this one out. Captain Reynolds didn't argue, he knew Jake wouldn't listen. He moved first, pushing the door open with slow, deliberate movements. The house was dark, but the kitchen light was on. A single, yellow glow illuminating the room. And on the kitchen table? A note. Jake's breath hitched. His father stepped forward, picking up the crumpled paper. The handwriting was messy. Rushed. Threatening. "You should have kept your mouth shut." The weight of the words suffocated the room. His father crumpled the note in his fist, his breathing slow but heavy. He turned to Jake, his face unreadable. "Pack a bag." Jake's throat was dry. "What?" His father's voice was calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "Now, Jake." And that's when Jake saw it. For the first time in his life, his father looked afraid. Jake ran upstairs, his heart hammering as he grabbed his backpack. He didn't even know what to pack. Clothes? A flashlight? His phone charger? His hands moved on instinct, stuffing items into the bag without really thinking. He heard Max's paws against the floor as the dog followed him into the room. Even injured, he refused to leave Jake's side. Jake dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Max's neck. "We're gonna be okay, buddy," he whispered. Max nudged his hand in response. Downstairs, his father's voice was tense as he spoke on the phone. "I don't care what the reports say," he growled. "Find Parker. I want every unit on him." A pause. "No. You don't understand. He came to my house." Jake swallowed. His dad was good at hiding fear. But tonight? He wasn't hiding it very well. They left within minutes. His father didn't say where they were going, only that it wasn't safe to stay. The streets were dark as they drove. Every set of headlights passing them made Jake's pulse spike. Was it Parker? Was he watching? Then, his father's phone rang. He answered immediately. "Talk." Jake could hear the voice on the other end. It was tense. "Urgent. Sir, we found his car." Jake's stomach clenched. His father's grip on the wheel tightened. "Where?" A long pause. Then. 3 blocks from your house." Jake felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs. His father didn't curse. Didn't yell. He just exhaled slowly, pressing down on the gas pedal. Parker had been here. Watching them. Maybe still watching. Jake turned, looking out the rear window. For the first time in his life, he felt truly, completely hunted. Jake's father pulled into a parking lot, far from the house, and shut off the engine. He turned to Jake, his eyes locked onto him with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "This isn't just about you anymore," he said. "Parker doesn't care about his badge. He doesn't care about the law." A pause. "But I do." Jake swallowed. "What do we do?" His father reached into the glove box, pulling out a second gun. He placed it on the seat between them. "We finish this." Jake stared at the weapon. At his father's unwavering gaze. Parker wanted revenge. But now? So did they. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the heavy tension hanging in the air. Officer Parker's confidence was gone now, replaced by something else, fear. Jake stood tall, arms crossed, watching as the police cruiser lights flickered against the nearby houses. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The younger officer shifted nervously. "Sarge, what do we do?" Parker clenched his jaw. "We handle this." But his voice lacked conviction. The squad car pulled up fast, stopping just inches from the scene. The door swung open before the vehicle had fully settled, and out stepped Captain Reynolds. Jake's father was a man who commanded attention without raising his voice. Broad shoulders, crisp uniform, piercing eyes that could strip a man of his confidence in a single glance. Right now, those eyes were locked on Parker. And they were cold. Parker swallowed hard. "Cap. Shut up." The words were sharp as a blade. Parker flinched. The younger officer took a step back. Captain Reynolds turned to Jake, his expression softening just slightly. "Are you all right?" Jake nodded, though his voice was tight when he answered. "Max isn't." The captain's gaze dropped to the injured golden retriever, still lying motionless on the pavement. His jaw tensed. A moment passed. Then, Reynolds turned back to Parker. And the fire in his eyes was lethal. "You ran over my son's dog?" His voice was calm. Too calm. Parker opened his mouth, hesitated, then nodded. "It was an accident, sir. The dog ran into the street. And instead of helping, you blamed him." Silence. Parker didn't dare answer. Reynolds took a step closer, his presence suffocating. "You think that badge makes you untouchable?" he asked, voice low. "You think you can act like this because you wear a uniform?" Parker said nothing. He didn't need to. The guilt, the regret, it was all over his face. The captain turned to the younger officer. "What's your name?" Officer Miller, sir." Reynolds nodded slowly. And did you try to help? Miller hesitated, then shook his head. No, sir. The captain let out a long, slow breath. Then, he reached for his radio. This is Captain Reynolds, he said, his voice carrying authority. Effective immediately, Officer Parker and Officer Miller are relieved of duty pending formal investigation. Jake's stomach flipped. His father wasn't just mad, he was ending them. Parker's face drained of color. Sir, please. I told you to shut up, Reynolds snapped. You ignored a child in distress. You disrespected your position. And worst of all, his gaze darkened. You didn't think there would be consequences. The squad car's back door opened. 2 more officers stepped out, ready to take Parker and Miller in. Jake watched as Parker clenched his fists, his breath coming fast. He looked like he wanted to fight. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because this time, justice had already won. And it was only the beginning. The night was unnervingly quiet. Only the distant wail of sirens cut through the stillness, growing louder by the second. Jake stood in the middle of the street, his heart pounding in his chest. His father's arrival should have made him feel safe, but something about this night felt wrong. Beside him, Officer Parker stood frozen. The moment Captain Reynolds' squad car came into view, a shadow of unease passed over his face. He shifted his weight, squared his shoulders, but Jake could tell, he was nervous. The younger officer, Miller, swallowed hard. He looked like a man caught in a wildfire, unsure of whether to run or accept his fate. The police car rolled to a stop, the flashing lights illuminating the street in violent red and blue. Jake had never seen his father look this serious before. Captain Reynolds stepped out of the car, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the streetlights. But his face? His face was a storm. His eyes locked onto Parker, and in that moment, Jake realized something. Parker wasn't afraid of getting fired. He was afraid of his father. The moment Captain Reynolds stepped forward, the air in the street turned ice cold. Parker opened his mouth to speak, but Reynolds cut him off with a single, lethal glare. Shut up. The command wasn't yelled. It wasn't loud. But it carried authority. Jake had never seen Parker look uncertain before. He always had an answer, a smirk, a way to talk himself out of trouble. Not this time. You ran over my son's dog, Captain Reynolds said, voice dangerously calm. And when he was lying there, injured, suffering, you blamed him. Parker licked his lips. Sir, it was. I said shut up. Miller took a cautious step back. He knew this was bigger than him now. Jake felt a strange sense of satisfaction watching Parker squirm. This man had spent his career intimidating people. Now, he was the one feeling small. You think wearing that badge gives you power? Reynolds asked, stepping even closer. You think it makes you untouchable? Parker clenched his jaw. With all due respect, sir. Wrong move. Reynolds' eyes darkened. Respect, he echoed. You don't even know what that word means. Silence. Then, the radio on Reynolds' belt crackled to life. Captain, we have a problem. Reynolds clicked the radio. What problem? Static. Then. Parker isn't in the system, sir. There's no record of his arrest. Jake's blood ran cold. He turned to look at Parker, and in that moment, everything changed. Because Parker, who had looked nervous just seconds ago, was smiling. Reynolds' hand tightened into a fist. What the hell do you mean he's not in the system? The officer on the radio hesitated. Then. Someone erased it. Jake's stomach dropped. Parker exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders like a man who had just dodged a bullet. Told you, he muttered under his breath. Reynolds turned back to him, his face unreadable. I have powerful friends, Captain, Parker said, his voice regaining its usual arrogance. You really think I was gonna let some punk kid and his daddy end my career? Jake's hands curled into fists. He had never wanted to punch someone this badly in his life. Miller looked just as stunned. He turned to Parker. "Wait, you knew?" Parker shrugged. "Of course I knew. You think I was actually gonna get locked up? Please." Miller's face paled. He had been following Parker's lead this whole time. Now, he realized just how deep the corruption ran. Reynolds stepped even closer, his voice dropping to something so quiet, so lethal, that even Jake felt a chill. "You think you've won?" Parker smirked. "I think you can't touch me." Captain Reynolds exhaled. And then, he reached for his belt. Jake's breath caught as his father unhooked something from his belt. Not his gun. Not his radio. His badge. Reynolds held it up between two fingers. The very symbol of his authority. Then, he threw it on the ground. It clattered against the pavement, a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to echo through the night. Parker's smirk faded. Reynolds took another step forward, and for the first time, Parker stepped back. "You think the system protects you?" Reynolds said, his voice calm, controlled. "I don't need a badge to bring you down." The words landed like a gunshot. Jake's heart pounded. He had seen his father take down criminals before, but never like this. Parker opened his mouth to say something. Maybe to laugh. Maybe to threaten. But before he could, another set of sirens filled the air. Parker's head snapped toward the sound. The flashing lights of multiple squad cars lit up the street. And this time, they weren't here to protect Parker. The squad cars screeched to a stop. Multiple officers poured out, weapons drawn. Parker turned, his cocky smirk gone. Reynolds didn't say a word. He just pointed at Parker. "Arrest him." For a second, Parker looked like he might run. But there was nowhere to go. Two officers grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back. "You can't do this," Parker shouted, his confidence cracking. "I have rights." Reynolds tilted his head. "Yeah. So did my son's dog." Parker thrashed, but the cuffs clicked into place. His face twisted in fury, his eyes locking onto Jake. "This ain't over, kid." Jake didn't blink. He just smiled. "Yeah, it is." The officers shoved Parker into the back of the squad car. This time, he wasn't getting out. Reynolds turned to Miller, who stood frozen. "You're done too," he said simply. "Turn in your badge." Miller didn't argue. He pulled it off his uniform and handed it over, ashamed. Jake watched as Parker was driven away, the flashing lights reflecting off the pavement. For the first time since this nightmare started, he could breathe. Max nudged his leg, his tail wagging weakly. Jake smiled. "We're okay, buddy." His father put a hand on his shoulder. "No," he said. "Now, we make sure this never happens again." Parker stood frozen, his chest rising and falling with quick, uneven breaths. His hand twitched near his belt, like he was considering making a move, but even he wasn't that stupid. The two officers waiting by the squad car weren't rookies. They were the kind of men who wouldn't hesitate to slam him against the hood if he resisted. Miller, the younger cop, already had his hands raised slightly, as if surrendering to the inevitable. He looked like a man who had just realized his career was over before it had even started. Jake watched them both, feeling something he hadn't expected, satisfaction. For once, bad cops weren't getting away with it. Captain Reynolds took a slow step forward, his face carved from stone. "Give me your badge." Parker clenched his jaw. "Sir, come on. Now." The single word left no room for argument. With stiff, jerking movements, Parker reached up and unpinned the badge from his chest. He hesitated for a split second, as if thinking about refusing, then dropped it into Reynolds' waiting palm. The silence that followed was heavy. Miller followed suit, pulling off his badge with trembling fingers. His fell into Reynolds' hand like dead weight. The captain studied them both, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and handed the badges to one of the officers behind him. "Take them in," he ordered. Miller didn't resist. He stepped toward the squad car with a defeated slump in his shoulders. But Parker took a step back. Jake's muscles tensed. "Don't be an idiot, don't be an idiot." Parker's face twisted with barely contained rage. "This is a mistake," he spat. "I've given years to this job. And you've wasted them," Reynolds cut in sharply. "Now, are you going to get in that car, or do I have to make a call that'll get you dragged in?" Parker's nostrils flared. He knew he had no way out. Finally, with a slow exhale, he surrendered. The officers cuffed him. Miller didn't need them, he was already broken. As they were led toward the squad car, Parker shot Jake a look. A look filled with hatred. "This ain't over, kid." Jake met his glare head-on. He didn't flinch. Didn't waver. Just stared at him, unwavering, until the car door slammed shut. Parker was gone. And Jake? Jake had won. His father put a firm hand on his shoulder. "Let's get Max to the vet." Jake nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as he glanced down at his injured best friend. The fight wasn't over, not until Max was safe. But as they drove off, sirens fading into the night, one thought burned in Jake's mind. The cops got what they deserved. And if there were more like Parker in this town, he'd make sure they got what was coming to them, too. The police cruiser carrying Parker disappeared into the night, its flashing lights vanishing beyond the darkened streets. Jake watched in silence, his fists still clenched at his sides. His heartbeat was still erratic, and the scene that had just unfolded in front of him felt like something out of a movie. His father, Captain Reynolds, stood beside him, unmoving. Jake had never seen him like this. Usually, his dad carried himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who had spent decades upholding the law. But tonight, there was something different in his eyes. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't relief. It was something closer to distrust. Because even though Parker was in custody, even though justice had technically been served, something still felt off. "Dad?" Jake finally spoke. "It's over, right?" Reynolds exhaled through his nose, glancing down at his son. His jaw was clenched. "No," he said. "It's not over." Jake's stomach twisted. "Why not?" His father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the squad car where Officer Miller still stood, his expression a mix of guilt and fear. "You need to start talking," Reynolds said to him. Miller hesitated. I don't know anything." Reynolds' eyes were sharp. "Don't lie to me." Miller swallowed. His gaze flickered toward Jake, then back to Reynolds. "Sir, I swear, I just followed Parker's lead. I didn't know how deep it went." Jake studied him closely. He wasn't sure if Miller was telling the truth or just trying to save himself. But then, Miller's voice dropped to a whisper. "But I do know this." He glanced around nervously. Parker's not the only one. The streetlights above them buzzed faintly. The wind picked up, sending a chill through the air. Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. His father's face darkened. "What do you mean?" Miller hesitated again, but then he sighed, as if realizing there was no point in keeping secrets anymore. "I mean, Parker had help." Jake's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, help?" he asked, stepping forward. Miller ran a hand through his hair, glancing down the street as if checking to see if someone was watching. "I mean, he wasn't acting alone," Miller admitted. "He had people covering for him. Inside the department." Reynolds stiffened. "Who?" Miller's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I don't know exactly. But think about it, sir. Parker's arrest record. Gone. That's not something a random officer can just erase. Someone high up helped him. Jake felt his blood go cold. His dad's hands curled into fists at his sides. Do you know where he was hiding after we arrested him the first time? Reynolds pressed. Miller shook his head. No. But, he hesitated again, then sighed. He always talked about a backup plan. Said he had insurance. If things went south, he wasn't going down alone. Jake glanced at his dad, unease settling deep in his gut. Parker had acted cocky even when he was cornered. Like he knew something they didn't. And now, Jake was starting to realize Parker wasn't bluffing. They drove home in silence. Max lay curled in the back seat, his breathing steady, but Jake could tell he was still in pain. Every now and then, his tail would twitch as if he sensed the tension in the air. Jake turned toward his dad. So what do we do now? His father didn't answer immediately. His grip on the steering wheel was tight. We do what we always do, Reynolds finally said. We find the truth. Jake nodded. He wanted to believe that was enough. But deep down, something told him they were already in too deep. When they pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. Unusually dark. His dad paused before stepping out of the car, scanning the area carefully. Jake felt the first twinge of unease crawl up his spine. Something wasn't right. Then, he saw it. A small, folded piece of paper tucked into the front door. Jake's breath hitched. Dad! Reynolds had already spotted it. He moved forward cautiously, pulling the note free. Jake watched as his father unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the words written in rushed, uneven handwriting. Then, his father's face went rigid. Jake leaned in, peering over his shoulder. And when he read the words, his stomach dropped. I told you this wasn't over. P. Parker. Somehow, he had sent this. Jake felt a sickening wave of dread settle in his chest. How? He asked, his voice hoarse. He's in jail. His father didn't answer right away. He just exhaled, long and slow. He had help, Reynolds murmured. And we don't know how far that help goes. Jake swallowed hard. What do we do? His father looked him straight in the eye. We prepare. That night, the house felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Jake lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling, Max curled beside him. He couldn't stop thinking about the note. The way Parker had smirked when he was arrested. The way his dad looked when he read the message. Jake had never seen his father afraid before. And the scariest part? Jake wasn't sure Parker was the only monster in the dark. The next morning, everything changed. Jake woke up to the sound of voices downstairs, his dad, talking in hushed tones. He slipped out of bed, padding down the hallway. His father was standing in the kitchen, speaking into his phone. No, it wasn't a prank, Reynolds was saying. His voice was edged with frustration. Someone left a direct message at my house. A pause. Then, Reynolds' grip on the phone tightened. What do you mean Parker's missing? Jake's breath caught. The conversation continued, but Jake didn't hear the rest. All he could hear was the blood rushing in his ears. Parker had escaped. The man who ran over his dog. The man who threatened him. The man who swore this wasn't over. And now, he was out there. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. And Jake knew one thing for sure. The next time they saw Parker, it wouldn't end in an arrest. It would end in blood. The ride to the vet was eerily quiet. Jake sat in the back seat, cradling Max's head in his lap, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breath. His dad drove, his grip tight on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road, but Jake knew his mind was elsewhere. Captain Reynolds wasn't just a cop. He was a man who hated corruption, who had spent years cleaning up the department. And now, his own officers had failed him. Jake swallowed hard, pushing back the lump in his throat. He couldn't think about Parker, about the rage in the man's eyes before he was hauled away. Not now. Right now, Max was all that mattered. The moment they pulled up to the emergency vet clinic, Jake threw open the door and ran inside. The receptionist barely had time to react before Jake slammed his hands on the desk. My dog, he was hit by a car, he's barely breathing. A vet tech rushed out, taking Max from his arms and disappearing through a pair of swinging doors. And then, the waiting began. Jake sat in a stiff plastic chair, staring at the floor. His father sat beside him, silent. The minutes stretched on like hours. Then, finally, a vet emerged. She pulled off her gloves and sighed. He's lucky. There's internal bruising, but no broken bones. We'll need to keep him overnight, but he should recover. Jake let out a shaky breath. Relief washed over him like a wave. Max was going to be okay. Captain Reynolds placed a hand on his shoulder. You did good, Jake. Jake nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Parker's words echoed in his mind. This ain't over, kid. Jake clenched his fists. He knew Parker was dangerous. He knew he wouldn't just let this go. And something told him. This was just the beginning. Jake barely slept. His mind kept replaying the events of the last 24 hours, the arrest, the threats, the note on the door. The confirmation that Parker was gone. Now, in the cold morning light, the world felt different. Max lay curled at his feet, his breathing steady, but every so often, his ears twitched. He was on edge, too. He could sense it. Something was coming. Jake pushed off the blankets and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. He could hear voices downstairs, his father's, low and serious, speaking into the phone. He didn't bother getting dressed properly. He just threw on a hoodie and padded down the hallway, following the tension in the air. When he reached the kitchen, his father was sitting at the table, rubbing his temples. His badge and gun lay in front of him, but he wasn't wearing his uniform. That alone was enough to make Jake uneasy. His dad always wore the badge. Always. Who were you talking to? Jake asked, his voice still rough from sleep. Reynolds looked up, exhaustion written deep in the lines of his face. Chief. Jake hesitated. And? Reynolds exhaled sharply. They're treating Parker as an internal matter. Jake's stomach twisted. Meaning what? His father's jaw tightened. Meaning they're not looking for him. Jake blinked, stunned. Wait. What? Reynolds leaned forward, pressing his palms against the table. They're saying Parker's already a disgraced officer. That he's not a high-priority threat. His voice dripped with sarcasm. They want to handle it quietly. Jake felt rage crawl up his spine. So they're just letting him walk? No, his father's expression hardened. They just don't care. Jake felt his hands curl into fists. This wasn't some small mistake. This was a warning. Someone was protecting Parker. Someone powerful. And if the system wasn't going to do anything about it, then it was up to them. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. We're going to find him, he said. Before he finds us. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs. His father wasn't just talking about an investigation. He was talking about a hunt. Max lifted his head, ears twitching. Even he could feel the shift in energy. Jake swallowed. How? His father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, grabbing his gun and badge. Get in the car, he said. Jake hesitated. Where are we going? His father's voice was deadly calm. To the only place Parker could be hiding. They drove in silence, the weight of the situation pressing against Jake's chest. His father took them out of the city, into the outskirts, where the roads were lined with abandoned lots, empty warehouses, and motels that looked like they had seen better decades. Jake glanced at his dad. How do you know he's here? Reynolds kept his eyes on the road. Because if he's being protected, they'll keep him somewhere off the grid. Jake nodded slowly. It made sense. Then he noticed something else. His father's fingers tapped against the wheel. A nervous habit. Jake had never seen his dad nervous. That's when he realized. His father didn't just think Parker was hiding here. He thought Parker was waiting for them. They pulled up in front of a rundown warehouse, its windows covered in grime. There were no security cameras. No movement. Jake's gut told him they were walking into something bad. His father reached into the glove box, pulling out a second gun. He handed it to Jake. Jake stared at it. You don't have to shoot, his father said. But you might have to aim. Jake nodded slowly, taking the weapon. It felt heavy. Then, together, they stepped out of the car. The moment they reached the warehouse doors, his father glanced at him. Stay close. Jake barely had time to nod before his father pushed the door open. The inside was dark. Empty. Silent. Too silent. Then, a click. A gun being cocked. Jake froze. A voice cut through the air, smooth and smug. Took you long enough. Parker. Jake's blood ran cold. He turned toward the voice, just as Parker stepped out of the shadows. A gun in his hand. Pointed directly at them. Parker's face was covered in bruises, but his eyes were still filled with pure hate. Reynolds didn't flinch. You should have stayed gone. Parker smirked. Oh, Captain, you should have known better. You think I'd let you ruin my life and just walk away? He took a step closer, keeping the gun steady. Jake's breath hitched. He could see it in Parker's eyes. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about making them suffer. I should have killed that dog when I had the chance, Parker sneered. Jake's vision went red. Before he could react, his father stepped forward. You're not walking out of here, Reynolds said, voice low. Deadly. Parker let out a chuckle. Neither are you. Then, the gunfire started. It happened fast. Jake dove behind a stack of crates as Parker fired. The bullet whizzed past, slamming into metal. Reynolds shot back. 2 shots. Parker barely managed to dodge, taking cover behind a support beam. Jake, stay down, his father barked. Jake barely had time to think. His hands were shaking, gripping the gun his father had given him. Then, movement. Parker was flanking them. Jake's instincts screamed. He spun, aimed. And fired. The shot wasn't perfect. It clipped Parker's arm, making him stumble. Reynolds took the opportunity. He charged forward, knocking the gun from Parker's hand and slamming him against the wall. The 2 men struggled. Parker was strong, but Reynolds was stronger. One brutal punch to the jaw, and Parker went down. Jake stood, his breath ragged, gun still clenched in his grip. His father loomed over Parker, who groaned, coughing up blood. This is justice, Reynolds muttered. Parker let out a weak chuckle. Nah, this is just the beginning. Reynolds didn't respond. He just pulled out his radio. Captain Reynolds. I have Parker in custody. A pause. And this time, no one's getting him out. Jake exhaled. It was over. For real this time. Max would be safe. His father would be safe. He would be safe. And Parker? He'd finally pay for everything. Jake barely slept that night. Even though Max was safe at the vet, his mind kept replaying the moment Parker was hauled into the squad car. This ain't over, kid. Those words didn't feel like an empty threat. They felt like a promise. The next morning, Jake and his dad went to pick up Max. The vet smiled as she brought him out, his tail wagged weakly, and his eyes were tired, but he was alive. That was all that mattered. Take it easy on him for a few weeks, the vet warned. No running or jumping for a while. Jake nodded, kneeling to scratch Max's ears. Got it, bud? You're on strict rest. Max licked his hand. It was the best thing Jake had felt in days. They drove home in silence, but something felt off. Jake noticed it first when they pulled into their driveway. His dad got out of the car, but his posture stiffened immediately. His eyes narrowed as he scanned their front door. Jake followed his gaze, and his stomach dropped. The door was slightly open. His dad held out a hand, signaling for him to stay put. He reached for the gun at his hip, pushing the door open with slow, calculated movements. Jake's heart pounded as his dad disappeared inside. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, Jake. His dad's voice was calm, but there was something in it that made the hairs on Jake's arms stand up. Jake stepped inside cautiously. His eyes darted around, taking in the house. Nothing seemed stolen or broken, but then he saw what his dad was looking at. The kitchen table. There was a note. A single piece of paper, scrawled in messy handwriting. You should have kept your mouth shut. Jake's breath hitched. His dad grabbed the note, his face dark as a storm cloud. Pack a bag, he said, voice tight. Now. Jake swallowed. Dad. Now, Jake. For the first time, he saw something in his father's face that he had never seen before. Fear. Jake didn't argue. He bolted up the stairs, heart racing. Parker wasn't in jail. Not yet. And now. He was coming for them. The police station was cold. Unforgiving. The kind of place where the walls carried the weight of too many secrets. Jake sat stiffly in the waiting area, his fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee he didn't even want. His dad was somewhere in the back, dealing with paperwork. Making sure Parker was processed correctly this time. It should have been over. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. Max lay curled up beside him, his tail twitching slightly in his sleep. Even in the heart of a police station, the dog seemed uneasy. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. His entire body was still wired with adrenaline, like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Because deep down, he knew Parker wasn't the only monster in this city. And monsters? They always had friends. The interrogation room was small and sterile, just a single table and 2 chairs. The kind of place meant to break people down. Parker, however, looked unchanged. Bruised? Yes. Defeated? No. He sat there in cuffs, his lips split, a streak of dried blood on his cheek. But his smirk was still there. That same smug grin that made Jake's skin crawl. Captain Reynolds stood on the other side of the table, arms crossed. His voice was ice. You lost, Parker. Parker chuckled, shaking his head. Lost? Oh, Captain. I was just getting started. Jake, watching from behind the one-way glass, felt a chill creep down his spine. His father didn't flinch. You're going away for a long time. Parker exhaled, tapping his fingers against the metal table. Maybe. Maybe not. His eyes flicked toward the mirror, and for a split second, Jake swore Parker was looking right at him. Then, Parker leaned forward. You think I did this alone? He murmured. The words sent a jolt through Jake's chest. Reynolds' expression didn't change. You had help. We already know that. Parker tilted his head. Do you? He smiled wider. Or do you just think you do? A pause. Then, softer. You really have no idea how deep this goes, do you? Jake's hands tightened into fists. His father's voice was calm. Who else is involved? Parker laughed. A slow, taunting sound. You'll find out soon enough. The moment Reynolds stepped out of the interrogation room, his phone rang. Jake was still in the waiting area, pacing. The second he saw his father's expression shift, he knew something was wrong. What? Reynolds barked into the phone. Silence. Then, the voice on the other end, a voice Jake didn't recognize, spoke in a slow, deliberate tone. You should have left it alone, Captain. Reynolds stiffened. Jake's stomach dropped. The line went dead. For a second, the world stood still. Then, his father moved. Jake. Let's go. Jake didn't ask questions. He grabbed Max's leash and followed his father out of the station. The second they stepped outside, Jake saw it. And his blood ran cold. A squad car. Their squad car. Vandalized. The windows were shattered. The tires were slashed. But that wasn't what made Jake's breath catch in his throat. It was the word painted across the hood. Liar. In thick, red streaks. It wasn't paint. Jake knew what blood looked like. Jake could feel his father's rage burning. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if his dad was angry out of frustration or fear. Because this wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of war. Reynolds took a deep breath, rubbing a hand over his face. Then, without a word, he pulled out his phone and made a call. Jake watched as his father's free hand curled into a fist. Then, his father's expression changed. Tightened. Repeat that, Reynolds said. Jake felt a shiver roll through his spine. Then his father hung up. We're leaving, he said. Jake blinked. What? Why? Reynolds turned to face him. His eyes were sharp. Because Parker's already out. Jake's breath hitched. How? His father clenched his jaw. Someone overruled the arrest. Jake felt his heart drop into his stomach. It was happening again. Parker wasn't just protected. He was being helped. From the inside. And if they had that much power? Nowhere was safe anymore. Reynolds drove like a man who knew he was running out of time. Jake sat in the passenger seat, still trying to process what was happening. Parker had been locked up just hours ago. Now, he was back on the streets. It wasn't just corruption. It wasn't just cover-ups. It was bigger than that. His father didn't say a word for a long time. Then. I need you to listen to me, Jake. Jake turned, his stomach tight. Reynolds' grip on the wheel was tight. This isn't just about Parker anymore. Someone high up wants us silenced. Jake swallowed hard. What do we do? His father's jaw tensed. We disappear. Jake's pulse spiked. Disappear? His father's voice was quiet. We leave town. Tonight. Jake stared at him, stunned. What about your job? The case? The people that need you? His father turned his gaze toward him. You're the only person that needs me now. Jake felt his chest tighten. Max whimpered softly in the back seat, as if sensing the shift. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Okay. Reynolds nodded, then stepped on the gas. As the city lights blurred past them, Jake's mind raced. Parker was out. He was hunting them. And now, they were officially on the run. Jake shoved clothes into a backpack, his hands moving fast but his mind racing even faster. Parker had been arrested. He'd been stripped of his badge. But that didn't mean he was done. The note on the kitchen table was proof of that. His dad's footsteps were heavy on the stairs. Jake, let's go. Jake slung the backpack over his shoulder and hurried down. His father was already securing the house, locking windows, double-checking doors. Captain Reynolds was always prepared, but this was different. This wasn't just some random criminal. This was one of his own. Max wagged his tail weakly at Jake's side, but even he seemed to sense the tension in the air. They moved quickly, getting into the car. Jake sat in the passenger seat, his dad's gun resting on the dashboard. The weight of reality hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was war. The car pulled out of the driveway, but before they could even get to the main road, Jake noticed something in the rearview mirror. Headlights. Bright. Too close. Too fast. His dad cursed under his breath. Hold on. The engine growled as he floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. But the vehicle behind them? It sped up too. Jake's chest tightened. Dad! I see it. The road ahead was dark and empty, stretching into the outskirts of town. No cops. No cameras. No one to stop what was about to happen. Then, bam! The car behind them rammed into their bumper. Jake's head snapped forward, the seatbelt digging into his chest. His dad clenched the wheel. That son of a... Another hit. Harder this time. Jake twisted in his seat, eyes locking onto the driver behind them. It was Parker. His face was barely visible behind the wheel, but Jake could see the rage in his eyes. The raw hatred. The promise of destruction. Jake's breath hitched. Parker had nothing left to lose. And that made him more dangerous than ever. Hold on tight, his dad growled. Jake barely had time to react before his father swerved. The tires screeched. The world blurred. And then they went off the road. The city was no longer safe. Jake sat in the back seat as his father sped through the dimly lit streets, eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. Somewhere out there, Parker was hunting them. The police weren't looking for him. They were covering for him. Which meant they had nowhere to run. Jake's father took a sharp turn onto the highway. We need to lay low until I figure out who's pulling the strings. Jake swallowed hard. And if we don't? Reynolds' grip on the wheel tightened. Then we don't make it out of this. Max let out a soft whimper in the back seat. Even he could feel the tension. Then, the headlights appeared. Too close. Too fast. Jake turned. His breath caught. A black SUV was tailing them. The SUV swerved violently, trying to force them off the road. Jake's father didn't hesitate. He slammed the gas pedal, the engine roaring as they surged forward. Hold on, he barked. Jake barely had time to brace before the SUV rammed them. The impact sent a shockwave through the car. Jake's heart slammed into his ribs. His father swerved, barely regaining control. The SUV pulled up beside them. Tinted windows. No badges. No sirens. This wasn't a normal pursuit. This was an execution. Then, a gunshot. Jake flinched as the side mirror shattered. His father cursed under his breath. They're not playing games. Jake's pulse spiked. Neither were they. The SUV was closing in. Then, his father made a choice. He jerked the wheel hard to the right. The car skidded, tires screaming against the pavement. Straight toward a construction site. Jake barely had time to scream before they hit the fence. Wood splintered. Metal bent. And then, they were airborne. For a brief second, time froze. Then, impact. The car slammed onto a pile of gravel, bouncing violently before skidding to a stop. Dust. Silence. Then, the sound of the SUV speeding away. Jake coughed, his lungs burning. His dad groaned, gripping the wheel. Max let out a weak bark. They were alive. But Parker had just made one thing very clear. He wasn't just coming for them. He was coming to finish this. The car hit the dirt hard, skidding through the roadside gravel. Jake's stomach lurched as his dad wrestled the wheel, barely managing to keep them from flipping. Max let out a sharp bark, his body pressed against Jake's side. Then, crash. They slammed into a stop sign, metal screeching as the car came to a jarring halt. Dust filled the air, the headlights casting eerie beams into the empty night. For a second, everything was still. Then, another engine roared. Parker's car didn't stop. He was coming. Fast. Jake's father reacted instantly. He reached for his gun, shoving open the car door. Get out. Now. Jake fumbled with his seatbelt, his hands shaking. Max scrambled after him as they spilled onto the ground. His dad took a defensive stance, aiming toward the oncoming vehicle. But Parker? He didn't slow down. The headlights were blinding, the roar of the engine deafening. He wasn't just trying to scare them, he was trying to finish this. Jake's heart slammed in his chest. Dad! Bang! The gunshot split the night. Parker's windshield exploded. The car swerved violently. Tires screamed. Metal groaned. And then, boom! The vehicle veered off the road, crashing into the trees with a brutal impact. Glass shattered. A thick cloud of smoke rose from the wreckage. Silence. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps. His father kept his gun trained on the wreck, eyes locked. Waiting. Then, movement. Parker stumbled out of the wreck, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. His breath was ragged, his hands shaking, but his eyes? Still filled with hate. Jake's dad didn't lower his weapon. It's over, Parker. Parker let out a bitter laugh, staggering forward. You think this is over? His voice was hoarse, dripping with venom. You took my job. My future. And for what? A damn mutt? Jake's fists clenched. Max growled beside him, weak but ready. Parker's gaze snapped to Jake. You. His lip curled. You did this. Jake didn't flinch. You did this to yourself. Parker took another step, too close. Click. His father cocked the gun. Move again, he warned, his voice deadly. Give me a reason. For the first time, Parker hesitated. The flashing of blue and red filled the darkness. Sirens. Jake turned, spotting multiple squad cars speeding down the road toward them. Someone had called it in. Justice was here. Parker clenched his jaw, his hands shaking. He was finished and he knew it. Within seconds, officers surrounded him. Guns were drawn. Orders were shouted. Parker had no fight left. This time, there was no escape. Jake watched as they cuffed Parker, forcing him onto his knees. His face was twisted in rage, but there was something else in his eyes now. Fear. Because this time, the system worked. Jake exhaled, feeling the weight lift from his chest. He glanced at his dad, who finally lowered his weapon. The storm in his eyes had passed. And Max? Max nudged Jake's leg, his tail wagging weakly. Jake smiled. We're okay, buddy. And for the first time in days? He believed it. Parker was gone. Sentenced for reckless endangerment, attempted vehicular assault and abuse of power. He wouldn't see the outside of a prison cell for a long, long time. Officer Miller. He turned on Parker, giving a full statement to avoid charges. He wouldn't be wearing a badge ever again. As for Jake and his dad, they moved forward. Stronger. Together. Max recovered, and every time Jake looked at him, he was reminded of one thing. Justice always catches up. And in the end, the bad cops got what they deserved. They didn't run anymore. They set the trap. Jake and his father returned to where it all started, the police station. If Parker wanted to end this, he'd have to come to them. Reynolds made the call. I want every officer I trust on standby. Jake checked his phone. No new messages. No calls. No one else was coming. It was just them. And then, the front doors swung open. Parker walked in alone. No disguise. No hesitation. Just that same smug grin. Jake's heart pounded. Max let out a deep, warning growl. Parker spread his arms. Look at you two. Playing heroes. He chuckled. Funny thing about heroes, though, his voice dropped. They usually end up dead. Jake's father didn't move. This is over. Parker smirked. No. It's just beginning. Then, he pulled his gun. Jake reacted first. He grabbed a coffee mug from the desk and threw it. The distraction was enough. Bang! His father fired first. The shot hit Parker in the leg. He collapsed, screaming. Officers rushed in. The ones they could trust. Guns drawn. Parker was done. This time, there were no second chances. Jake exhaled, his hands shaking. His father lowered his weapon. Justice had finally been served. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Corrupt cop taken down by his own captain. Parker was gone. His accomplices were exposed. And for the first time in weeks, Jake felt safe. Max nudged his leg, his tail wagging slightly. Jake smiled. It was over. For real this time. And no matter what came next, they had already won.